How good the Lord is. Blessings to each of you. I am excited to sit with Pastor Kennedy to have a conversation with all that's been taking place in our nation and our world. We felt that it was time for the two of us to have a conversation, to speak to our congregants, to speak to our community. And we're going to talk a bit about church. Three aspects of it will be church, community, and culture, as we talk about race relations, the racial tension that we see happening in our nation. And it's no secret that we've been seeing much of this for years, but I think that we're seeing something more that I believe it's like historical in the sense that it has reached not just a few states, a few cities, but it's reached the entire nation, and it has ultimately reach the world. So I'm so delighted again to have Pastor Kennedy sharing with us. We both serve at the New Mount Olive Baptist Church here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So we're delighted to have this opportunity to share with you, Pastor.
Thank you so much, Pastor. And of course, you know, I am bubbling over to have this conversation with you. And we've talked via the phone on many occasions about America and what perhaps our views are. And of course, I think now is the right time for us to come together and share with people what we literally are boiling over with. You talked about this tension, racial tension being now that which has infiltrated the world. It's like unto the pandemic. It has gone global. Right. And indeed, Pastor, I think what we're actually seeing and experiencing, we're seeing a watershed event. Hence, I think this is a tipping point, inflection point. I believe that perhaps we could actually be in for the best life that you and I could imagine.
Well, that being stated, let's kind of get into a few questions I want to just ask you to get your perspective. First one is, what should the response of the Black church in the midst of the racial injustices happening? What should our response be in the midst of all the racial injustices that are happening now?
Pastor, that's a good question. It is a good question because when I think about the racial tension, systemic racism, structural racism, when I think about America and all that America represents, exceptionalism, hegemonic practices, imperialism, when I think about all of that, I have to think about the church. And I think about the church because when all of this was actually evolving to this level of intensity, I began to think about perhaps what we are experiencing. Yes, it's evil, but I like to categorize it as the maturity of immaturity. And I say immaturity and maturity because I believe what we're seeing is the mature manifestation of whiteness, of perhaps white supremacy, white privilege. I think we're seeing the maturity of it, but then I think we're seeing the immaturity of a nation that has not in 400 years have not grown, a nation that refuses to grow up. So what do I think that the Black church response should be? Pastor, I think the Black church response should be what it has always been, to the degree that she has always been a model manifestly of the power of love. We've always embodied in flesh, existentially, we've always engaged in this love ethic. And hence the church must not only be, but she must give herself to becoming all that she is already. Now, having said that, I think the question is, who are we? Because I hear so many people now denigrating the Black experience and denigrating the Black church. And the truth is, I like perhaps W.E.B. Du Bois, 1903, The Souls of Black Folk. He reminds us that the church was even at that time the epic center of community life. The church was the refuge, the fortress, the citadel by which those who were oppressed, suffering, could run and be safe. Now, having said that, W.E.B. Du Bois would suggest, I like his suggestion. He suggests that there are really three major characteristics of the black church: the preacher, the music, and he says the frenzy. He says the shouting. I like that. But he starts with the preacher. And Pastor, I believe in these volatile times of unrest, times of great denigration of race, time where nationalism has raised its head again, even via the White House. I believe it is the preacher's, or it's the preacher's responsibility to lead the church into this environment of social uplift, hence protest. Historically, it was the preacher who led the church in times of racial injustices. It was the church. Now, having said that, the preacher must lead the way. I think the preacher starts with, Pastor, in my estimation, a return to sound doctrine. I think we've so become enamored, enraptured by prosperity preaching that we've literally just crafted a gospel that sounds nothing like the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The preacher has to get back to preaching. Priestly he must become. But not only priestly must the preacher become, but prophetic as a witness to that which he preaches must the preacher become. Now that is to suggest that I think it starts with the preacher. Okay. Then, Pastor, here it is, music and frenzy. Now I'm spending a little time because I think it's important. W.B. Du Bois says the music was about two things. It was about joy and it was about sorrow. It was our way of, yes, celebrating, but it is our way also of dealing with our trauma, dealing with our oppression. So the music is key. We can't afford pageantry. We can't afford, not in these times. And then he says the frenzy. Now, here's what you got, the frenzy. He says the shouting, the shouting. Now what he suggests is that all the shouting wasn't just about the spirit. The shouting was about oppression. The shouting was about suffering. The shouting was about pain. So you say, what should the church do? Be the church. Don't give up preaching. Don't give up singing. And don't give up shouting. But we've got to do more than that.
But you know, I think that's significant. I'm going to tell you why I think that's significant, because you speak from the vantage point of the black church,
yes,
the black preacher. And because of what we've seen with white evangelicals, I think that they have used the Bible and God in a way to give a perspective of Christianity that probably does not align with the scripture. So what would be your word to the white evangelical pastor who is a part of this collective silence in the midst of this racial tension that we're having? What do you say to the preacher who doesn't look like you, but says, I'm praying for you?
Here's what I say to him. I say what Walter Brueggemann has said in his book, Interrupting Silence. That if you're going to be a part of the solution, you got to break your silence on white privilege, on white supremacy, on racial superiority. You have to break your silence. And here's the point. You can't do it anymore in obscurity, inviting me to lunch, hence to a prayer meeting with you. You got to do it from the pulpit. You can't do it just from documentation. And of course, you know better than I, Pastor, 1995, the Southern Baptist Convention, which at one time was the largest Protestant convention in our nation. And you know, in 1995, they issued an apology for their support of slavery. Indeed, they enforced it, they reinforced it, they supported it. Their Southern Baptist apology, but that was on paper. Now note, in just 2 years removed, 2018, a Southern Baptist Theological Seminary came out with a 71-page document. And of course, they would delineate their participation in slavery. Their founding members were owners of slaves. And hence, every seminarian was trained under the doctrine or the indoctrination of race superiority. And as a result, it is embedded. It is intrinsic to their disposition. You got to break your silence. Hear this. And if that ain't enough, 2016 election said a whole lot to us about evangelicals. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. Here's what I say to my brother. I love you, but you're going to either be a part of the problem or the solution. And the only way you can help America right now, not just me, but America, break your silence.
So in essence, there's going to have to be this almost public presentation.
It has to be.
Not just in prayer, but also in preaching, prophetically, even from the evangelical.
Yes.
And the black church has to continue to be a resounding voice, not being silent, not getting comfortable, but be a resounding prophetic voice. How does that work when we're dealing with the pandemic? It would be customary that we would have had some type of corporate rally, some type of corporate prayer, corporate worship. But since we can't corporately come together, what do we say to that young black man who has a young black son, or that young mother? And we're saying with a church of love, we're forgiving. How do we find this place of balance in being passionate for the fight, yet being prayerful and forgiving, peaceful people in the same moment? How do we wrestle with that?
Pastor, I think relative to our youth, I think first of all, we have to embody justice, fairness, love. And matter of fact, someone has said that literally when you talk about justice, it is what love sounds like in public venues. And so, Pastor, when you talk about our youth relative to justice, we have to embody it. We have to enflesh it. But we also have to literally tutor them contextually. Hence, we need to connect them to their history, share with them who they are under this perhaps canopy of Americanism. Who are you? And I think we have to spend more time affirming and confirming who they are in these volatile times.
Okay. Well, and I know we could talk about the church piece on and on, there's so much more, but let me go to the community. I want to raise this question. How do you believe the code of silence among police has affected the trust between the police and the black community? Because in our community, they say, if you see something, say something.
Yeah.
And we see that in the black community, you're a snitch. The police say you should say something, but then the police oftentimes, they will exercise this code of silence that they won't see something, say something. What's the response to that as it relates to the community? How do we work through that aspect of it to deal with it?
Pastor, lamentably, but I think you would agree that in these times, where perhaps once maybe we would have given some semblance of respect and honor to law officers, I think right now all that we do is superficial to the degree that many people see that blue, that green, whatever color the uniform, they see it as potential death. They see an officer now as an instrument of death. Perhaps if not death to that extreme, they see an officer as the enemy. Now the question is, how do you engage your enemy, adversary? How much information do you give your adversary? I think, Pastor, he who has created the problem owes the community, hear me, a solution for the problem he has created. I think that our law enforcement must take the initiative to create now a transformative experience between law officers and the black community. I think the initiatives must be on their part. Think about this, Pastor. Over 100 years ago, I think it was Victor Hugo, Frenchman, who said that if a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. Now, say it again, because don't want you to miss it. If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. Hear this. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. Who has caused this darkness to come over communal interaction with police officers? Who've caused the darkness? Martin King said when he heard that John F. was killed, Kennedy was killed, his speech literally had such seminal snippets I share. And the snippet is, he says, while the question of who killed President Kennedy is important, he says, the question of what killed him is more important. And then he goes on to say, America has some deep soul searching. And I think when it comes to relationship, Pastor, there is no reconciliation without sacrifice. There's not reconciliation without some struggle, without some suffering. And I think our law officers, hence enforcement, when you've criminalized me, I see you as the enemy. When you're incarcerating me, mass incarceration, over 1 million African Americans are imprisoned. We are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Hence, you racially, you profile me, you frisk me, you target me. And you want me to be cordial? And you want me to be kind? And I hear what people are saying. I love police officers. We have some here in the church. Love them. But let's be honest. Historically, they ain't the problem. Problem is, it's a system. It's a structure that has created this darkness, that has created this climate for killing our black young men, hence weaponizing their black bodies. Law enforcement has some work to do. And unless they're committed to the work, we'll never have a relational, interactive engagement unless they are committed to the work.
And you know, I think that's the question is it more on the community or on law enforcement to build that relationship? You know, I'm saying the community should be open, but I think, as you said, the work has to be more on their part than on the community's part, because they have been the ones who've been the catalyst to the anguish and the pain. I'll give out my own transparent just reality. A few days ago, I saw 4 officers, and the feeling that I had when I saw them should not have been the feeling that I had when I saw law enforcement. Now, they didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. Nothing. It was just the tension of all that I've seen. I just felt, I don't know, different. And that, if I felt that, I'm wondering how many other black men, black women. And it's because I think of the reality that we've seen. Our interactions oftentimes lead to our demise. Unfortunately, you know, many times we see instances where it leads to a death. And you know, we have this conversation, you know, there are a lot of good cops, a lot of bad cops. But I think that conversation is a challenge in the sense, if the good cops are not stopping the bad cops, they become complicit with the bad cops. So now they look like bad cops, or they've exhibited the behavior of bad cops. So I just wonder, from a community perspective, how should that, should the community have more expectation from a policy perspective? Should we have more expectation from, you know, transparency in how the police, the law enforcement are funded, because I know we hear a lot about defunding the police, and people think that that's getting rid of the police, but they've been defunding education for years. You still have schools. So I think it's reallocating resources. And should we have so many resources allocated to quote unquote crime prevention, or should we have some of those resources allocated to uplifting and building up our communities, so you don't have to call the police? You don't have to react. So what are your thoughts as it relates to the policy and maybe even the funding aspect?
Pastor, it's not so much that we defund, and I hear that cry. I think it's reform. Not so much defund, I think it's reform. And I think unless we have leadership, and I'm talking about rank and order in these departments, who literally hear the cry of Black America and hear this, and we'll say something about this, but Black lives matter. You got to hear that cry and hear our traumatized existence, because you think about how long we've endured this, and there is indignation. And for some of us, it's righteous indignation, but for some of us, it is raw indignation. But nonetheless, we have a right to be angry. So don't make us feel as if we are immoral, unethical by how we feel. We have a right to be angry right now. But I think it starts, Pastor, in leadership. And I think unless we can ensure that the right persons are in leadership. You talk about policies. Yes, we need policies. But on the local level, we need policies. Okay, that's where we got to start. But we need leadership on the local level in places of high rank to help the Black community, hear this, settle calm, so that we might even be open now to relationship.
Well, let me ask you, as we go from church, community, now culture, I want to ask you one basic question about culture that I want to see. How do you believe racism has affected the identity of Black people as it relates to faith, family, and finances?
Faith. So you keep me on track, Pastor. Faith. James Baldwin would say that a person's identity is only questioned provided he or she is seen as a menace. When we look at faith, hence our identity, what we look at is mythological indoctrination, that from the commencement of Christianity on this planet, it was the effort of Eurocentric Christianity to recreate, to remake, to reshape. Pastor, since you asked me that question, here's what you piqued in me. Do you not know, perhaps historically, we have not perhaps given ourselves to our history as we ought, that before we could talk about empires and before we could talk about civilization and life, we would have to visit Africa. Because Africa is not only where, hence the cradle, the birthplace of civilization, of life, it is also the birthplace of Christianity. And as a result, what we see in faith, in its formation, we see whiteness, white supremacy. Take Christian, might I add, take their version of Christianity and hermeneutically impose it upon the Black community to the end of dismantling our God-oriented identity. That's where faith has gone awry in terms of our identity. But no, it's not new, Pastor. Mythologically, it's not new. Here it is, the serpent in the garden. He talks to Eve, and the first thing that he literally sets his gaze on in terms of deception was undermining identity. Because you got to understand that if I undermine your identity, I'll literally undermine your integrity. If I get your integrity, I'll undermine your potential, your destiny, your development. Because it's all tied into identity. So Satan said, okay, you're not who he says you are. Not telling you your full identity. And as a result, fallen from integrity, undermined destiny, hence development. Now, as a result, I can't be who I was designed to be because faith has literally duped me. So it's been that faith, Pastor. But the black church, praise the Lord, has reinforced the fact that we are God's children, made in the imago Dei, the image of God. And we've come to a realization that race is just a social construct creation.
Right.
Racism, hence, is just another word for whiteness. We are somebody, matter of fact, Pastor, 15th century, as it were, we're somebody. We had empires in Africa in the 15th century. We had empire. Here's the point. We had our own names. We had our own language until they came to ravage Africa and taking from us not only our identity, because if you take my name, you take my identity. If you take my language, you take my identity. But ravaged our country.
So that affects family then.
It affects family, Pastor, because here's what you do. You now, middle passage now, families are separated.
Right. Stripped apart.
Stripped apart, Pastor. And so here it is, under the rubric of Christianity, families are separated.
So, but you know, when you think about families ripped apart, you think the middle passage, and you think about what's happened to a lot of immigrants, illegal aliens, if you will, put in cages, stripped from families, you see the same history repeat itself with a different ethnic group.
Pastor, it's the same. It's the same.
Robbing of identity, ultimately affecting family.
Yes.
Which, there again, that's the sins of our country. Constantly repeating themselves.
Yes.
Which now, if I rip families apart, I take your identity, and then I put you in a place where you'll fail financially. It's like I put you in a position where I can control you. You have to come to me.
That's it, Pastor.
For what you need.
That's it. I Americanize you.
Right.
And I literally bring you to compromise you under the oppressive hands culturally of America. Now here's what I like. Pastor, do you not know African Americans, black folk, have always been ingenious. We've always been creative. It's hard to keep us down. Dwight Hopkins wrote a book some years ago, Down, Up, and Over. But he talks about slave religion and black theology. And of course, he has a chapter that's quite interesting, because he says that from sun up to sundown, it was master who was recreating, reconstituting the black body, hence the black experience. That's from sun up to sundown. But from sundown to sun up, here it is, black bodies recreated the self to the end that they did not cultivate their false self. Hence, if they would, it was for pageantry. Hence, it was a smokescreen for deception. Or they knew, even in clowning, that there was a code, there was a signal. And Pastor, what I'm suggesting to us is that we have to get back to our faith so that our family will be enriched, empowered again, because that's the key to community, is the family. And then fitness, Pastor. When you say fitness, amazingly, it's amazing, Pastor, that if you talk about fitness, whatever the unemployment rate is in America, it's double for African Americans. Fitness. What about health care? Affordable health. Well, what about universal health care? What about a living wage? If you want to talk about fitness And it's so difficult, Pastor, because many of us don't even attend physicians for extreme illnesses because we have no health care. So when you talk about fitness, let's talk about poverty. Because again, all of this is interrelated. We talk about fitness. We have to talk about whiteness. We got to talk about privilege. We got to talk about this whole business of racism to undermine the black reality, hence racialized reality, fitness. But then finances, think about it. Finances, shucks, we just talk, if you incarcerate me, now I'm released, recidivism rate is great, I'm subject to return, but if I don't return, perhaps what am I going to do? Because you've so structured systematically and systemically America that it has no place for those who have literally fallen.
Right.
And so, Pastor, I am upset because the truth is this Puritan, pristine attitude of America must cease if there's to be any healing racially. But when you talk about this business of faith and family and fitness and finances, here's the point. Ain't no meritocracy in America. It's white privilege. So when you start talking about finances, for over 244 years, forced labor, we work free. Last one hired, first one fired. We do have to work triple, not just double. We have to assiduously engage ourselves. So when you talk about finances, we are suffering, and a stimulus check won't help us. You're going to have to do more than a stimulus check. Pay us what you promised to. Reconstruction, pay us what you promised us so that at least we can be in the same ballpark.
Well, I pray you were blessed by this conversation with Pastor Ken and I. We're going to do more of this. And in the form of a closing, I want to say to those who are protesting, I say protest with passion, protest with purpose, but let your protest also lead you to the polls. I say those who have privilege, take your privilege to the platform. And as you get to that platform with that privilege, make sure that you publicly push for others to have the same equity, the same justice that you would have and that you know is so well deserved. Pastor, I want you to give us a challenge. What would be a challenge that you would challenge our viewers and listeners to do after this, after they've listened to this conversation, after they've heard what we've said? What are one or two things you would challenge them to do?
Pastor, one of the first things I would challenge our people to do is to read. Read about our history. We have such a rich history. Read about our history. You say, I don't know what to read. Start with The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. But read. Don't ever be vulnerable to secondhand knowledge. Read so you can critically reflect. Think for yourself. Be an independent thinker. That's what I would say. But not only read. Here's what I would say to you. Pray for our country, understanding that there is no dichotomy between prayer and protest. You pray, but protest. And just know Black Lives Matter. And just know that there is no peace without justice. And hence, we've come this far by faith. And we've been leaning on the Lord. And you can testify He never failed us yet. That's what I would say, Pastor.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to seeing you in the next conversation. Again, we appreciate you. And as we always say, we love you. And there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. God bless.
Blessings.